and I looked in that open door. Sitting on the floor was this safe. To a burglar, like the safe is the prize. Like, oh, this is my big break. And we took that safe and we carried it out to the bed of my pickup truck, tossed it in, and drove back to my house. And eventually I pried open the door enough that I could reach inside. There's an ATM card in there, and then there was this memory card. I put the memory card into the computer tower, clicked on the first one. And I mean, it was shocking. I knew stuff like this existed in the world. I just never imagined I'd be sitting at my desktop computer with it on my screen. So I knew something had to happen. I wasn't exactly sure what that something would be, but I knew I had to do something.
Hello, Matthew. Thank you for joining me today.
It's good to see your face again.
It's good to see your face again. You have the kindest eyes.
Oh, well,
It's like
thank
when you hear your whole story and I cannot believe everything you've been through, and you just seem like this very calm person. Is that due to the all the meditation you do? And you're Buddhist, right?
you. I practice Buddhism, yeah. I like to think that I'm calm. I mean, it's not always, it might be something I present as, but it might not
Hmm.
be, it might not be calm inside.
Okay, I'm just wondering if like there's something I should be doing so that I can feel like you have a very non-frenetic energy.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah. Uh I know your story from an interview you did a long time ago. I won't even say where, but that pretty much blew me away. And then I've been following you a bit here and there through the years. You're coming up on no, you're past 20 years of
Right.
sobriety.
A couple of weeks ago.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. Feels
That's
like
huge.
feels like a lifetime ago, right?
Well,
Well, it kind
I'm
of is a
coming up
lifetime
on
ago.
16 years. When I met you, you already had quite a few years. So, yeah, I mean, right? It's a long time to be sober.
Yeah, I'm almost 21. Which I've always liked those kind of like analogies in recovery where someone becomes a teenager or like, look, you're 16.
Right.
Like you're 15 right now, right? So
Yes.
you can have a provisional license. You can drive with your
Hmm.
parents.
Hmm.
You know,
You're
I don't,
almost legal to drink.
I guess so, right? Like it's kind of weird, or gamble.
That's true. I still do that, just for the record. I'm not like a gambling addict. This is not an intervention. It's just like, listen, I'm not gonna like lose my house, but we have to have some fun. Do you have any vices?
I mean, I play video games sometimes, but I even haven't done that in a number of months. I've been so focused on, kind of other things,
Hmm. Hmm.
some writing. I've been meditating a lot more lately, so I've been trying to stay away from even the video games.
Okay.
Yeah, I eat Doritos too much, probably.
Okay.
Like
Okay. You're not perfect then.
a whole bag when I'm watching Netflix type Dorito addiction. So I think
Yeah.
that,
Well, who doesn't? So you're writing a book about this story that we're about to hear. You're writing a memoir,
that's right. Yeah.
straight memoir, right? Yours, the story of your life, kind of.
I'm not sure it's going to be the whole life, but it's going
Okay.
to be, maybe an 8 or 10 year period. Yeah.
Okay. Well, for our purposes, let's start at the beginning. Take me back to your childhood. Happy, crazy, chaotic. Tell me this far back as your story
Um,
starts.
no, not particularly chaotic. Um, Happy childhood. Uh, at least for up until maybe the tween years.
Mm-hmm.
And the only disruptions were really, parental strife. My parents would eventually get divorced, and of course, those sort of things began long before the divorce actually happened. So, um, yeah, there was definitely some pain in the house growing up. Not a pain that's all that different from, I think, a lot of kids growing up in America today, if you look at divorce rates and whatnot. But I was still a kid and I didn't understand what was going on, why my parents were fighting, why they were sleeping in different bedrooms. Um, but other than that, like nothing particularly that stands out,
Was there
phys-
addiction in there?
there was no addiction in there.
Oh, interesting.
Nothing like that. Um, as far as I know, and I don't have a large family, my family's relatively small. I have a couple of cousins and a couple of aunts, like not a whole lot going on there. I guess I have three aunts. Uh, and I don't know anybody in my family who has alcoholism or addiction other than myself.
Okay.
Uh, Black sheep, like literally, right?
Right, right, right. So, okay, so when does that stuff start?
Uh, yeah, the first time it started with pot, and pot has not always been legal, as we know. And I was kind of just a curious kid, and some part of me that was deeply distrustful of authority, and um, so I kind of had a scientific attitude, like let's try it once and see, kind of way of meeting the world. And I do remember going to dare classes when I was a kid, the Nancy Reagan era, just say no to drugs, or those, I'm sure you remember them, the videos or the commercials that would have like an egg frying in a frying pan that said, this is
Oh,
your
yeah.
drug. You remember that stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so I had this idea that, if I did drugs, I was going to end up, in very swift order on the streets, a junkie, begging, homeless, the whole thing that you imagine, at least as a kid, as the worst possible consequence of using drugs. And I just assumed that that's what happens. That's the way it was kind of taught to us. So uh, I stole a little bit of pot that I'd found in a babysitter's like drawer and smoked it in a park with a friend. I was in sixth grade and nothing happened. Uh, and so some part of my mind was like, oh, they were lying to me, right? They were all lying to me.
First time I smoked pot, same exact, I stole it from my parents and we rolled joints and we smoked it and nothing happened.
Nothing happened. I don't even
I
remember
don't,
getting high, much
yeah, I
less getting
didn't.
in trouble. And I should point out that I had like kind of typical kid stuff. I had stolen beers from the fridge growing up. Uh, but it wouldn't be a stretch to say that I was the only one drinking the beer in the fridge. Like my parents would leave like a case of Coors in the fridge in the garage, and I never saw anybody ever drink them. So I might go out and drink it and catch like a little tiny buzz or something. And then 6 months later or a year later, if I stole another one, I was probably the next person to drink a beer. So they never even noticed that I was doing that. But I do remember enjoying the sensation. I do remember going like, well, that's kind of cool. I feel bubbly. Um, but it wasn't anything that became anything at the time. It was just something, when I was bored.
Hmm.
But then I smoked that pot in sixth grade, and that didn't amount to anything initially either. I didn't suddenly start trying to find pot. Um, what actually happened is later on in eighth grade, uh, I was introduced to pot again, this time from friends. I didn't like steal it from a babysitter. And we just started like, we were latchkey kind of kids, there was parents weren't home until 6 or something in the afternoon. And so we spent some time smoking a lot of pot after school. And then I got arrested pretty quick, like at school, at a school dance. I was caught with a bong and some brick weed, and I was suspended for a week. So that it happened pretty fast there. And it was kind of weird because I was a teenager and everybody, we feel unique when we say we didn't feel like we fit in, right? Like I didn't feel like I fit in. I was kind of too nerdy for the jock crowd, and I was too rough around the edges for the nerdy crowd. Like this is what I like to tell myself. I'm not sure that is a unique experience as a teenager, but after I got arrested and then got suspended from school and then came back, I just noticed people treated me differently. Like there was like this weird respect that I got, not just from other students, but from like teachers. Teachers started talking to me like as if I was an adult. I had teachers tell me about when they used to smoke pot at the whatever concert back in the day, and talking about the Doobie Brothers and things like that. And I actually had a teacher ask me once if I could get them something.
Wow.
And so there was this kind of like thing that happened where I was like, oh, like maybe this is my identity. Like maybe this is my role. Kind of the smart kid who's edgy, the smart kid who does things that are maybe a little bit against the grain, who perpetually challenges authority. And that was kind of like the beginning of the end. Even though I didn't start getting high again right away because I was scared of the trouble I'd gotten in. When I went to high school the next year, I just kind of became a kind of a little skater, little hippie, whatever you want to call the fusion between the two, and a punk rocker. And that just kind of led from one thing to the other: pot smoking, lots of drinking, eventually cocaine, and then eventually, as we both know, meth. That's the short version of the story, right?
Yeah. So I hear a lot. I mean, not just here, but just in life and talking to people who struggle with addiction. How does it go though from cocaine to meth? Like, do you remember a point where somebody was like, "Hey, do you want to try meth?" Because I don't know, there were certain drugs for me where I was like, I'll do this, but I won't do that. Like that sounds crazy. But then I have other friends who are kind of goody goodies who also did meth and were like, yeah, I got a lot of rooms clean in my house on meth. Like,
That's a good question. Like, I think for a long time I did have that, weed and mushrooms are natural and alcohol is just fermented fruit kind of like attitude about drugs and alcohol. And I remember the first time I did cocaine, I was at a beach in Santa Cruz. I must have been 15 or 16 years old. And I do remember having fear about it. But I was with people I trusted. I was with people that I'd known, in a way my whole life. And they just put it out. And I was like, all right, I'm scared, but he just did one and he just did one and nothing crazy happened. So I might as well try one. And I feel like there's like a certain boundary that gets crossed the first time you do something like cocaine. And so eventually when meth came later, I didn't have like an attitude around meth that was different than cocaine. So I'd already crossed that threshold. I'd already entered that doorway. And
and
so
what was it like the first time?
first time I did meth, I hated it. And that's because it was our older listeners might remember this era, but there was like a crank era of meth use, like where it was not what we, think of today, like the crystal meth stuff that's probably more prominent today. And that would enter my life a few years later. And so I didn't actually like it. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I kind of like chewed my mouth a bunch and felt really uncomfortable, and didn't like it too much. So I did it for, I don't know, maybe two like little mini runs, like 2 or 3 or 4 day runs, and didn't really come back to it until about a year later. And at that point, I tried like what we called the real. I tried crystal meth is what they were calling it at the time. And the only reason I experimented with it again is because I had missed like the first month of my senior year. I had mono, and so I missed the first month of school. I had to do a lot of catching up. I was expected to catch up with the work that I'd missed. I was expected to keep up with the work I was getting assigned. And because of the mono, I'd had something like chronic fatigue syndrome. I was falling asleep a lot. I couldn't stay awake. And a really close friend of mine was living with me at the time because his family was trying to sell their house to pay for cancer treatment, experimental cancer treatment for his father. And so we were there together, and we kind of collectively came up with the idea that maybe speed would help you stay awake.
It's
And
not
so,
a bad idea.
I mean, it's not all that
It makes
different.
sense.
It's what
Huh?
people in college do today. Maybe they don't
Yeah.
use meth, but they're doing something similar. When I was
Adderall.
yeah, that's exactly what I'm pointing at. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the thinking. So I called the guy that I had met when I was doing meth the year previously, and bought some. And this time it was a different beast. This time it was something entirely different. And the best way to put it is I felt like Superman. I didn't just have the ability to like stay awake and study. I felt like I could think more clearly. I felt more confident. I felt like any insecurities that I may have had previously, they just disappeared. All of that was gone. And that was, I want to say, like the second month of my senior year in high school. And I dropped out of high school within 60 days after that.
So it really helped. You caught up so much that you're like, I don't need this.
I got a lot of studying done in the beginning. But then I don't know how much detail you want me to get into with regards to the events that precipitated me dropping
Yeah.
out of high school.
I want to hear.
All right, you've ever heard of meth monsters?
No.
All right. Some people, I've learned this through interactions on social media. Some people call them shadow people. So a meth monster is essentially some of the hallucinations that start to arise when you haven't slept in a while and you haven't eaten in a while. And in the beginning, they would make us really paranoid. They'd make me really paranoid. I'd look out the window at night. I'd think I'd see people kind of sneaking around in the bushes, hiding in the shadows. And so I was really paranoid. And eventually, we were smart kids. We're like, this can't really be happening, right? There can't actually be people in the bushes because every time we walk up to the bush, they're not there anymore. So what's really going on? And so we had come up with this set of rules for how to assess whether the meth monsters were real. And one of them was that if you shine a light on them, they disappear. One of them was if you talk to them, they never talk back. And the other one is if you stare directly at them, they stop moving. I think those were like the three rules, right? And that's because like the hallucinations often were like kind of at the periphery of your vision in the dark. And, you'd look out the window and you'd think you see something and you'd look over and you wouldn't see it anymore, but you swore you saw something off in the corner of your eye. So we came up with these rules and it's how we would test our hallucinations. And eventually we stopped being quite as paranoid about them. And so there was a point, I was hanging out in my driveway one night. I wasn't particularly methed out. In fact, I'd slept the night before. It was around midnight. I was hanging out in my driveway with a friend. And my mom had this white picket fence on the side of the yard on a street that didn't have any street lights, but was kind of backlit by a main road. And we thought we saw somebody like creeping up to the fence. Not standing up, but kind of like creeping up as if they were like hunched over. So it kind of looked like, I don't know, a whale's back coming out of the water every once in a while. When you look out in the water, you see like a humpback whale. That's what we thought we saw, but we both saw it. I'm like, okay. So we went to the garage, we got an axe and a flashlight, and we walked up to the fence, and I had the flashlight and I shined it over the fence, and there was a guy dressed in all black, like dressed like a ninja, doing what I wouldn't have known this at the time, but he looked like he was doing Tai Chi or something.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, okay, I'm shining a light at him. It's still there. I'm looking at him. He's still moving. There's only one option left. I need to try talking to him. So I said something like, "Who are you?" And he just roared. He just like stopped and he screamed and roared at me. And it was terrifying. Like I was terrified to the core. And we booked it back into the house. Shut off all the lights inside the house, turned all the lights on the outside of the house on, so the light would reflect off the windows and they couldn't see us. And long story short, he had a friend pick him up, and whenever he got to wherever he was going, he called the cops anonymously and said, "Hey, I think I saw something on the street." Verta Vista Lane is the name of the street. And so the cops didn't go patrol the street. They knew me well enough. They just showed up at my house and said, "What's going on?" And like a dumb 17-year-old kid, I'm like, "I thought I saw a ninja."
Oh my God. But he was the one doing something wrong, right? He was skulking around your house.
I can't explain it to this day, right? But I told the cops that I saw a ninja. And they're like, "Matt, how much meth have you been doing?" I'm like, "I haven't actually done any meth today." They're like, "How long has it been?" I'm like, 3 days. And I slept since then. Like I'm not high right now. I swear I saw this. And so they took me to juvenile hall. They drew my blood and all this other stuff. And when I got there, they kind of interviewed me. There's like a counselor who interviewed me. And that counselor determined that I was not under the influence, that I was totally sane and totally rational, so ordered me to be released. So I got released from juvenile hall in like 5 hours. I got home when the sun was coming up. And I felt like, I'm a teenager. I felt like some soldier who just come home from war or something. I don't know. And so I took a walk in my neighborhood. I was like smiling, smoking a cigarette. The sun was coming up. And I get back to my house and the cops show up again. So somebody had called the cops on me because they thought me walking around the neighborhood, smoking my cigarette that early in the morning was suspicious. And the cops were like, "What are you doing? Are you high again? What's going on?" I'm like, "You guys were just here like 6 or 7 hours ago, and you said the same thing, and you took me to juvenile hall, and they just released me, and I literally just got home from juvenile hall." And I showed them my arm where they'd drawn the blood. I still had the cotton ball taped to my arm. I'm like, "Look, just go call your buddies and find out." And they did. And they said, all right, you're right. We're sorry. We'll let you be. And so they drove away. And for whatever reason, something broke in me that morning. I was like, in my weird teenage way, the world isn't meant for me. Like, I'm not meant to be in school. They don't understand me. Something along those lines. And I never went back to high school. That was
And
it.
what about your parents during any of this? Were they upset? Were they like, you're grounded?
Well, my father had moved out at that point. He moved out maybe about a year earlier. So he moved out during my junior year of high school. And so it was my mom and I. In fact, just before the cops came to my house, I had actually gone and woken my mom up and told her that I'd seen a ninja and that
Oh
I'd
boy.
seen someone creeping around in the yard nearby. And so when the cops came, she was actually very defensive of me. And she was like, he saw somebody that looked like they might be a burglar, and you're here trying to arrest him. So like at that time, at that moment, she wasn't aware of any long-term meth use. Now you could argue there was some naivete there, but she had also didn't have a history with drug use. She tells me years later that she had found like cut straws around the house, but she had no idea what they were for. She had no idea that I had been cutting straws and using them as tutors.
Right.
And so I think this was early enough in, you could call it my meth career, that she wasn't quite sure what was going on. And so she wasn't really mad at me then. She wasn't mad at me then.
Okay. So then what happens? So now you're out of school.
Out of school. Uh, well, I told myself I was going to go to junior college, and I went and I took my GED, and I did cocaine on the way to taking my GED, and I
Like you
passed.
do.
Yes, right. I don't know why I did cocaine for the GED and not meth, but that's just how it worked out. Um, but that didn't last long because like I didn't have the structure of school, or high school, like school I had to go to really kind of keep me in line.
Hmm.
And I was using meth more and more. I was staying awake longer and longer. I was eating less and less. I was becoming increasingly less employable. I think I was working at Starbucks at the time, and then eventually they dropped me to like one day a week, 4 hours, where I'd come in and just clean the place because they didn't want me actually manning the cash register or the espresso machine. And so what had started off in the beginning as kind of like a way of trading for drugs, I eventually started stealing in order to support my entire lifestyle. Right. Early on in the meth use, I would hang out at like construction sites at night because, if you're staying up all night and you've got a younger sister in the house and a mom, it's not really the best place to party. So my friend and I would typically find a construction site somewhere and just kind of hang out there all night. And it was there that I started seeing tools, and I would steal those tools and trade them for drugs, trade them for meth. But I had some, as twisted as it sounds, some like sense of ethics around my stealing. I'm like, okay, like I'm stealing from companies, I'll steal from stores, but I won't cross the line and steal from people's cars or their houses and things like that. But as I use more meth and as I became more in the habit of stealing, the stealing itself started to take on its own addictive kind of nature. I started to feel like this sense of empowerment and excitement around stealing itself. And so I would, rather than just stealing a little bit and trading it for drugs, I would actually just get high and then go out stealing. And so I would spend entire nights, roughly from like midnight to 4 a.m., scouring neighborhoods for construction sites and things like that. And eventually I started seeing open garages, and I justified it somehow. Well, they shouldn't have left their garage door open. So I'd go and I'd steal from an open garage. And then when I was in open garages, I'd crossed kind of like that cocaine threshold. There was kind of like, oh, I've crossed this threshold now. What's the difference between looking in a car if it's unlocked? So I'd look in an unlocked car and then I'd steal something from there. And then once I'd crossed that threshold, well, why not just check the door in the garage to the house? If it's unlocked,
And there's no cars.
right, I might as well steal from there. And so it's like this, the progressive nature of the stealing followed similarly the progressive nature of drug use.
Were you doing it alone, or did you have did
Back
you
then,
buddy system?
back then I was mostly alone. Back then it was
Was
mostly,
it a secret, or did your friends know And were they like, good for you?
Um,
Get us some money too.
a, a lot of it was happening in the dark. I had one friend who knew. Um, and then there were friends that I knew were stealing themselves, but everybody tried to hide it from each other because we
Hmm.
didn't want people to know that like this was all coming from stealing. And I knew there were other people doing it, but we never did it together. There was almost this like unwritten, like we don't want to admit that we're actually stealing stuff. Uh, but yeah, once I was willing to go into unlocked garages or unlocked cars or even unlocked homes, I just, what's the difference between breaking into? And so I'd say within, let's say, a year or so of having dropped out of high school, I was probably spending a lot of my nights per week, most of the night, committing burglary, whether it was auto burglary and garage burglary. That was the bulk of it. I didn't typically and often go into homes. That was a little bit of a wilder thing to do, a little bit more dangerous, but it did happen occasionally. And so I, in pretty swift order, was committing what we could think of as strikeable felony offenses multiple times a night, all week long. That's right.
Wow. Okay. So first time you get caught?
Yeah, I was 18. I
Oh
was
my
about,
God. This was, so you were still really young.
yeah, I was 18
I
years old.
mean, because you dropped out of school. So this is within a year. Wow. Okay. So you're 18.
Yeah, I dropped out when I was 17,
Okay.
and uh, that would have been like the fall of 1997, right? Yeah, fall of 1997. And I was arrested for my first felony case in February of 1999. So what is that, 16 months or so, something like that.
So what happened? How did you get caught? And were you scared?
I don't know if I was scared when I mean, sure, there was fear, I suppose, but I guess I should tell the story a little bit. But I had, uh, my car had been impounded, my truck had been impounded, and so I was driving my mom's minivan, but I had somehow broken the key off in the ignition of my mom's minivan. So strangely, like if I had to do a burglary, I had to like pull up into a neighborhood and I would like leave the car running, go around and like steal from houses. And I went into some house on a street that was actually at a dead end that was pretty far away from my home. And I just had this bad feeling, some like spidey sense type thing. Um, I likely had heard a noise or something like that in the house. Maybe not consciously, but subconsciously. And so I decided to leave and I stepped outside the house and it was on a hill. It was nighttime. And as I was leaving the house, I saw kind of like a slow trail of headlights coming up the street. And of course, this is like 2 or whatever in the morning. And so I just knew it was the cops. And I knew I couldn't drive out because it was a dead end street, and I knew my car was running a couple of houses down, and so I kind of just ran down the hill. And when the cars were getting close to me, I jumped off into the bushes, and lo and behold, it was like 3 or 4 sheriffs driving by. So I knew I was toast, and I ran through the hills and ran through backyards, and I eventually made it to my mother's house, where I hopped in my window, and then like kind of frantically for an hour or so tried to hide things. I was putting them in the attic. I was trying to hide things in the garage. I was trying to hide things in like the hatch below my mother's closet, like all these places. Meanwhile, there's a sheriff parked out in front of my house at the curb, essentially probably waiting for backup or some sort of information leading them to believe that I was inside. And eventually they
Wait,
did.
do you think they saw you running and
No,
followed you home?
no.
They just suspected it was you?
Well, I'd left the running car there.
Right.
I left the vehicle running at the site of the burglary, and they'd pulled me over enough times in that minivan
Okay.
to know.
Okay.
I mean, it's like they know it's me, right? Uh,
Okay.
I initially they just didn't suspect that I was home, so they were probably waiting for me to either show up or just get the call to go ahead and go in. And at some point, that's what they did. They just came in, and they arrested me. Uh, I mean, it's kind of funny. Like once I heard them coming in the front door, I hopped in bed under the covers and pulled them up and tried to act like I was sleeping.
Amazing.
And then so they popped in, and I like acted all surprised. I'm like, "Oh, I'm sleepy. What's going on here?" Something stupid like that. Uh,
Uh-huh.
it didn't work, but
I've
and so
had commercial auditions where I had to pretend to wake up, and it's some hard acting. Let me just tell you, to pretend to be asleep to like, what? What time is it? Is real bad.
yeah, Terrible acting, I'm sure.
So you get brought down. Did you go
Yeah,
to trial? What happened?
yeah. So I don't know what I was, how many charges I was arrested for in the beginning, but it would eventually lead to, I was taken to the county jail, and I was in the county jail for 4 or 5 months at the time. I was in the county jail for 4 or 5 months, and during that period of time, they had kind of amassed, I think, 20 felony charges.
Oh my God.
Um, I want to say 9 or 10 of them were first degree burglary. And in California, that's a residential burglary, and in California, that's a strike. Uh, so I was facing not I couldn't get struck out all at once because it was my first like major arrest, but I was facing a ton of time because those are all very serious felonies. I mean, I think at the most they can carry up to 6 years each.
And at this point, you are over 18.
Yes, I'm over
You're
18.
not a minor. Okay.
No, no, I'm not a minor. So I'm in the county jail, eventually bailed out. My parents bailed me out and put me in residential treatment. And I did 30 days in residential treatment and then moved to an SLE. And then I became a house manager. I was like an 18, 19-year-old house manager an SLE.
So SLE is sober living?
Sober living environment. So
Okay.
I don't know what they call them in your neck of the woods.
Sober
but
living. Yeah.
sober living, yeah. And so, yeah, I lived there. I was, of course, introduced to the 12-step program at the time. I considered myself sober, even though I occasionally went and did whippets on
Uh-huh.
on the weekends.
But at this point, you're waiting for trial? Like you're waiting.
Yeah,
Okay.
still technically fighting my case.
Yeah, got it.
And so, but that's my first exposure to the program.
Mm-hmm.
And I made it look good. I worked with a sponsor and did some of the steps. I heard all the slogans. I heard, like the idea that your addiction is doing push-ups, and like the nature of alcoholism, and I knew how to talk it. I knew how to, if need be, go into court and talk all about the 12 steps and everything they'd done for me. It was all bullshit, but I could have done it. But some part of me in the back of my mind, it was like, I'm 19 years old. Like, I've never even been to a bar. So yeah, I shouldn't be doing meth. I shouldn't be doing coke. Like, somewhere in the back of my mind is like, yeah, but like once all this passes, however that needs to happen, I can just live a normal life. Right. That's like kind
Yeah.
of going on in the back of my head. And so eventually I accepted a plea bargain. It was accepted a plea bargain of 12 felonies, 9 strikeable offenses. So I pled guilty to those 9 first-degree burglaries. And I was sentenced to 5 years and 8 months in prison. And what's kind of important about that part of my story is that those 9 strikeable offenses were all 3 strikes under California's 3 strikes law, which meant that if I was arrested for any felony again, even though I'd only had 1 felony arrest, if I was ever arrested for a felony again in my life, I already had 3 strikes, which meant no matter what, it was 25 to life for, you could steal a pizza, you could steal a bike, it doesn't matter. It's 25 to life. You could get caught with possession of methamphetamine, a felony, 25 to life. So that's what I was setting myself up for with that plea bargain.
Now, I completely understand that this is part of your story, but that sounds unfair. I know we can't redo the system, but like, what? I don't think you should get all 3 strikes at once.
I mean,
That should be 1 strike. I mean, I don't know. How do you account for all the people out there that are constantly seemingly going to jail and then getting back and getting out? I mean, how do you account for like a P. Diddy or, I'm talking about people who seem to commit a lot of crimes and then they're back out. We still have the 3 strikes thing, right?
yes, we do, but it's actually been amended a little bit, in the sense that you can no longer, your 3rd strike has to be strikeable now. Right?
Okay, got it.
So
It
if
can't be just anything.
it can't be any felony, right? It used to be if you had 3 strikes on your record, then your 3rd strike, you can get struck out and get 25 to life for any felony. Now your 3rd strike has to be serious or violent crime.
Okay.
Which, as we know, with my case, it wouldn't have changed anything eventually, but we haven't gotten to that yet. But they have amended it, so yeah, there's not people, for the most part, still sitting in prison who stole a pizza. As their
I was the one time I served on a jury, it was 20 years ago. and the person did commit they were being charged with felony threats because they'd gotten in a car accident, they were drunk, and they were saying they had a gun and they were going to like shoot everybody. They were very drunk though. I'm not trying to stick up for them. I'm just saying the way the case was, I remember feeling really bad. I found out afterwards that it was a three strikes case and this was the guy's third strike. And so now he was being put away for like a really long time, even though he hadn't actually had a gun in his car. And he wasn't like, he was just very drunk. He had gotten into an accident. No one got hurt. You know what I'm saying? And I just felt like, oh, so really he's now being put away for life or for a very long time for this, which if it wasn't his third strike, I don't think probably today that wouldn't be strikeable, or would it?
It depends on how they charged him. Like
Yeah.
I don't know what like the specific charges were, whether it's what we call a wobbler. A wobbler is a crime that can be charged as strikeable or not. Like my first degree burglaries are strikeable offenses, but there are instances in which it could be considered non-violent enough to not be a strike.
Okay.
And so it depends on whether what he did was a wobbler or not. And I don't know the ins and outs of all the charges. So
Okay. So you go to prison. This is a whole story in itself.
the
I mean,
first,
yeah, the first time.
yeah,
So how long are you there?
it
How long
wasn't
did you
actually,
end up being there?
it ended up not being super long. Well, maybe for some people it sounds like a long time, but like total, if you include the time that I was in the county jail before bailing out and my time after getting sentenced to 5 years, 8 months, I only spent about just a little bit under 2 years in jail, in prison. And I paroled in a couple of weeks before September 11th. So I paroled at 21.
Okay. And how was that?
Prison?
Was it super cool?
Yeah, it was great. It's funny because when I think of like having gone to prison, I sometimes don't think of that first prison term as my time in prison. It's
Right.
weird. And I think it's because, as strange as this might sound, like I wasn't away for long enough to like have made the place my home. It was one of these things where I kind of like spent my first half reminiscing about my prior freedom, and I spent the next half like kind of like looking forward to going home. And like one thing that would come to characterize my time in prison is that like what really makes prison is when you realize like this is where I live now and I need to make my life here. And like it has such a different vibe than what I experienced that first time in prison. But I was still exposed to what I would have to be exposed to significantly later, but like racial politics. I was exposed. This is California prisons, a general population yard. Everybody's segregated according to their race. And then different races have certain types of alliances. People get hurt when they violate these racial rules. I saw people get hurt. And so
How long were you there before you started to really know that? I mean, is that like the first thing you learn,
first
or
thing you learn. My first day in San Quentin State Prison.
is this where you were your first, really
My
your
first
first
day in prison, yeah, was
San Quentin?
Yeah,
Wow.
it's a great place to do time now, though. That's a
Is
different.
it?
Yeah, like everybody wants to do time in San Quentin now. Well, not everybody. There's like some people that don't want to go there, but if you want to do programs and cool stuff like go to college or train dogs and things like that, San Quentin is the place to go.
Freaking first thing I thought of was training dogs.
Yes, now you know. And but like back then, it wasn't quite that way. It still had death row, and it was still there's still a relatively serious yard there. And yeah, I was in my cell. I'd only been there a few hours, and some white guy shows up at my cell, and he's like, "Where are you from? What's your name? Where are you from?" And I tell him, I'm from Santa Clara County. He's like, "All right, I'll find your homeboys." An hour or two later, another white guy, with swastikas and all the other stuff on him. He's like, "Hey, I'm such and such. What do you need?" And I said, "I don't know." He's like, "Well, you can't leave your cell without boots. So what size boots do you have?" And I told him. And he's like, do you need coffee? Do you need cigarettes? I'm like, "Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll take coffee and cigarettes. I could use both of those." So he comes back some time later with boots and coffee and cigarettes. And he tells me, he's like, "Here's how it's going to work. You're going to get counted at 4:30. And about a half hour after count, you're going to look up to the top of your cell door, and there's going to be a little bar that slides out of the way. and you're going to wait for that bar to slide out of the way, and you're going to sneak out of your cell, and you're going to meet us in the chow hall. And I'm like, sneak out of my cell? What are you talking about? He's like, just trust me. Act like you know what you're doing. Bring your shower bag, throw a towel in there, throw some food, put a cup, make it look good, and meet us in the chow hall. I'm like, okay. So that's what I did. And it worked. It was so wild. I was terrified. I just opened my cell door when I saw the bar like slide out of the way, and I closed my cell door and I walked right by the cop with like my little shower bag slung over my shoulder, like I knew what I was doing. I didn't even know where the chow hall was. I had to hope that his instructions were adequate. I made it to the chow hall, and that's where I met a bunch of other homeboys, white guys from my area. And that's when they essentially told me the rules. And I'm just terrified. I'm like, what is going on here? Like, these are my people. They've got those tattoos that I can't even imagine having. And they asked me, like, do you know the rules? And I was like, kind of trying to feel, act a little tough. I'm like, yeah, I know the rules, but why don't you refresh my memory? Something like that. And then they told me, and I'm not going to repeat, the language they use, but it was something along the lines of like, don't mess with no black people, don't mess with no gay people, and don't gamble more than you got. And that's a good introduction to the rules, right?
Wow.
And it plays out in all sorts of different ways. You don't share food or cells. You don't share cigarettes or anything with people of different races. You don't have the same areas in the yard. You don't have the same shower heads. You don't have the same water fountains. You don't have the same pull-up bars. You don't have the same picnic tables. You don't have the same basketball court. You don't have the same handball court. And to like enter those territories, like accidentally walk through the basketball court of someone else, a different race, then you could get hurt, So you have to learn all of that stuff while you're there. And it was fairly
still like that?
As far as I know, it's still like that on general population yards in California. Yeah.
So sad.
And to a certain extent, growing up in the community I did, this was pretty unfamiliar territory for me.
Right.
It's not like I'd never been exposed to racism before, but I really hadn't been around what you could think of as like proud racism. Right?
Yeah.
I hadn't been around the type of racism where people just say I guess the quiet part out loud.
Yes.
Right. It was very new to me and terrifying. And also like certainly, disheartening because I realized that they were also the only people who would protect me. Because there was no option of like, okay, I'm not a white guy. I'm going to go to the unaffiliated cell and I'm going to bunk with unaffiliated people. Like that wasn't an option that was available,
Right.
So whether I liked it or not, those were my people.
But so what did you do with your time there? Were you one of those people that was like, I'm going to work out and I'm going to read, I'm going to write a novel?
Well, part of my sentence was that I had to do a drug program inside. So I did, like my regular 40-hour-a-week job for a lot of my time was going to this drug program during the day. But yeah, I worked out, read a lot of books, wrote letters, talked on the phone, collect phone calls, stuff like that. Learned pinochle, became a good pinochle player.
I mean, there's just this little part of me, and I promise you, it's like the smallest part of me, but I'm like, would it be that bad to like play cards all day, like hang out, no phones, no distraction, just make real good friends? I'm kidding. Yeah. But you made your way through it, and then the time came where you got out. So were you sober? So you were sober. You were doing this drug program. Were you sober
inside?
Prison? Yeah, inside.
Well, while I was in there, I tried a cup of Pruno, and it was so gross. I didn't mess with it anymore. What Pruno is like prison wine. No,
oh, okay.
Like prison wine, but it was wine that was made out of ketchup. And so it was like a really, really disgusting Bloody Mary. And so I took a couple of sips of it and I was like, no, this isn't my jam right here. Plus I was too scared of like getting caught and like not being able to parole, because one of the conditions for my release was doing this drug program, not getting in trouble, and then having to go to the parole board. And so if I got in trouble, then I would be removed from the drug program and then put back into it. And so you'd have to start it over.
Okay.
So it was really important to make sure I stayed enrolled in the program because my parole was contingent upon it. And so I was a little bit paranoid about getting in trouble. When there's eyes watching me, I'm pretty good at behaving,
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I came home relatively sober in that sense, and went back to the same drug program I'd been in that time between when I was fighting my case. So I went back to residential treatment.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, because the state was mandating it. Uh,
Even though you'd already been in the drug program like the whole time you were inside?
yeah, because it was before I'd been sentenced. It was before any of that. It was essentially when I was doing it, it was an attempt to um, hopefully show the state that I was trying to do well while I was out
Right.
on bail. And now that I was sentenced to prison and I had a requirement for parole to attend do a residential treatment and then live in an SLE, that's what I did again. So I just went back to the same program. They just slid me back into being a house manager right away, though.
Okay. And were you being drug tested?
Yeah, yeah, it was.
And at that point, did you feel differently than you did before you went in where, because I know as a person in recovery, just were you like, I don't think I really am an addict, but I have to do this to prove, just to keep my freedom. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, were you believing it?
Uh, I don't think anything had changed since the year or two earlier when I basically came to the conclusion that I definitely can't use hard drugs again, but that when the time comes, I'd like to go to a bar.
Okay.
I'd like to smoke some pot. And around that time, people were starting to get kind of medical marijuana licenses in California, and that was a little appealing to me. I wanted to try a bar. I wanted to see what what life is like when you just do the normie thing, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so that was definitely there in the back burner, um, a reservation if you might. And yeah, I got off parole. I came home when I was 21. I got off parole, I think, sometime in early 2003. So when I was 23 years old, and I started smoking pot again. I was allowed to drink while I was on parole, and so I'd say about halfway through my parole, I started going to bars again, or not again. I started going to bars.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Did you have a
and
job?
yeah, at the time I started out. I worked as like a roofer, but I was going to college full time as well.
Okay.
Um, I was going to the local junior college and I was working as a roofer, and then I got a job like selling satellite dishes, like Dish Network and stuff.
Yeah.
So I was doing that and going to college, and I was doing well. I was getting a 4.0. My plan was to transfer to a university and kind of move on with my life. But then some things kind of sent that sideways.
Okay. So go on. So things are going kind of well
Relatively
for
well.
a
Yeah.
while. You're drinking, you're moderating. I won't say you're moderating because you're not even trying, but it's not a problem at this point. The
Yeah,
drinking,
I'm
pot.
moderating to the extent that, yeah, I'm only getting drunk on a weekend night. And, maybe I'm smoking a little bit more pot than I should, but I was still doing well in school and I was keeping my job and all that other stuff. Um, and I mentioned earlier how I had that friend that lived with me when I was a senior in high school. He's a longtime childhood friend. This is the one whose father was dying of cancer.
Yeah.
While I was in prison, he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And
Your friend or the dad?
my friend, yeah, my friend.
Oh,
In
okay.
fact, yeah, his dad passed away while I was in the county jail, and then while I was in prison, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and yeah, he committed suicide when I was 23. So that's the
Oh,
year that I got off parole, and I found out about it. I was on a plane. I was boarding a plane from Seattle to San Jose, and I found out about it right when I boarded the plane, and so I had this hour and a half on the flight, and I was already drinking, but I remember there was some inflection point. There was something that happened like that moment on that plane. I remember looking at the steward. What do we call them again now? Flight attendants.
flight attendant. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I ordered a Bloody Mary, and I ordered another Bloody Mary, and I just drank the whole flight, and something changed right then. It's almost like I could drink and smoke pot when everything was fine. I could do it successfully, but the moment, it's almost like somewhere in the back of my mind, I wanted an excuse, and I suddenly had one. And yes, I was in a ton of pain. And yes, I was in a ton of grief. But what was also happening was that I was looking for a reason to completely obliterate my life. Like I was looking for a good social excuse to kind of just jump off the deep end. Some part of me just, that's what I wanted. And so that would have been of October of 2003. And I think I relapsed on meth 2-3 months later. So it didn't take long.
Okay. So you start doing meth on your own with friends, meth buddies?
Well, yeah. Well, this is where where some of the recommendations of the program are true, right? Like, hang out at the barber shop, eventually get a haircut type stuff. Like I didn't actually get rid of a ton of my old friends. I certainly didn't get rid of all of them. I kept a few that were close friends, and that some of them are still close friends today, but they also weren't partiers like I was. They weren't meth heads like I was. But the guy that I got the job from, that I first went to for a job when I came home from prison, was the guy that I was buying meth from before I went to prison.
Right.
He's the one who offered me a job, and he wasn't doing meth anymore, so it seemed kind of like a safe-ish thing. But he started doing meth maybe a year earlier, and so occasionally he'd offer. He's like, "Hey, Matt, you want some?" And I was like, "No, no, no." But then life showed up for me, and I was a daily drinker, and it seemed like a good idea at some point. So you can say no 99.9% of the time, but eventually that means you say yes, and that's what happened. And all bets were off. All bets were off. Like not only, like that whole idea of your addiction doing push-ups, your drug addiction doing push-ups, my stealing addiction had been doing push-ups. And I picked up like literally right where I left off when I was 19 years old or 18 years old when I got arrested the first time.
And you knew at that time that if you got another strike, that you were going to go do a lot of time. At this point, you knew that.
Of course, yeah.
And it just something had switched in your brain where you were like, I don't care, or you just weren't thinking about that?
I wasn't thinking about it. In a way, I was already committing a third strike felony just by using meth. Like possessing meth in my car was enough to do 25 years to life in the state of California at the time.
Right, right.
I'm not saying that there wouldn't be the possibility of more mitigation, like if you go to court with a drug charge for 25 to life. But from the strictly legal standpoint, like a felony was a felony. With that said, there's obviously more danger of going to jail when you're stealing than if you're just getting high at your house, but there wasn't a rationalization around it. There wasn't, the stealing was impulsive in the exact same way that the next drink is impulsive. The stealing was no different than looking at the bag of meth and doing a line. That's what it felt like. There was actually one point when I approached the anniversary of my first arrest. It was February 18th. And I remember going this is an unlucky day. This is an unlucky night, right? I'm not going to go out stealing tonight. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stay home. I'm just going to chill. And it was literally like chomping at the bit, like white knuckling it at home, trying to not steal. And by the time 1 a.m. rolled around, I couldn't stop myself. And I was in my truck out in the neighborhood stealing. Like that's what it was like.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a difficult thing to kind of wrap my brain around. It's a difficult thing to, in a way, say out loud because there's some social sympathy that comes with saying you have a drug problem. There's some social sympathy that comes with something that's in the DSM, right? But how much sympathy is there for someone who says they're addicted to stealing? Like the first time I'd gone to court, I said I had stolen in order to support a drug habit, but here I was, and in reality, I was stealing to support a theft habit.
Wow.
And yeah, as we know, I would eventually get arrested again in April of 2005.
Yeah. Tell me the whole story.
Well, so we have to backtrack a little bit.
Okay.
So yeah, I committed a burglary in February of 2005, right around the time that I had that night where I couldn't stop myself from going out. And on this particular night, I had an accomplice. I didn't typically go out stealing with people, but on that night, there was something I thought I was going to be finding at a house. I was looking for like a three-wheeler, like an ATV three-wheeler.
Okay, yeah.
And someone had told me that there was one house that had one, and I wanted to go steal it. And I knew that I might need a little bit of help stealing it, getting to my pickup truck. So I brought this guy with me that I sometimes used with. I'm not going to call him a friend because this is just the drug world. He's not my friend. He's just a guy that, I would get high with and sometimes hang out 8-10 hours at a time doing drugs with and never even share a word, never even speak to each other. We'd just be in our corners of the room just getting high. That's the type of acquaintance he was. But we did go out. We showed up at this house about 2 a.m. And on the way into the property, we kind of had to pass by a cottage that was at the front of the property, like an in-laws unit or something. And then there was a main house on the back of the property. And we had to pass between these two residences to go look for this three-wheeler, which we didn't find. And kind of like the first time I got arrested, I had this weird spidey sense. I had something felt off while we were digging around in this house's backyard, that I'm like, okay, you know what? The three-wheeler isn't here. Let's just leave. And I whispered to him, hey, let's get out of here. And as we're leaving the house, something's different. There's a light now shining across the driveway in front of the house. And that in-laws unit at the front of the property, its back door was wide open. The light was on inside, and it was kind of like just shining out into the area we had to walk through to get out. And it struck me, I'm like, someone's awake. Someone is out here with us, And this would typically be in a good occasion to just run, right? Just book it. And I did whisper, come on, let's go. There's someone out here. But I got curious as I walked by that door, and I looked in that open door to that cottage, and I looked through a laundry room, and I looked into a bedroom, and sitting on the floor was this safe. Just sitting there. And like, to a burglar, like, the safe is the prize, right? Like, it sounds weird, but it's like, you can steal knickknacks and all these other things, but then you see a safe and you just imagine like, oh, this is my big break. And this was out of character for me in the sense that I did not like going into places where there was such a high probability of confrontation. And in fact, you could argue that the whole reason I was a burglar like I was at night creeping around is because I didn't want to have a ton of contact or conflict with people. But something got into me, and I walked right inside. I whispered to the guy, come help me. He didn't want to do it, but he did. And we took that safe and we carried it out to the bed of my pickup truck, tossed it in, and drove back to my house.
How big was it? I mean, I'm picturing a big safe, but was it little?
It wasn't little, because then I wouldn't have needed a hand. Honestly, like, memory is like pretty bad around this, but I want to say it was maybe 2 feet tall.
Okay.
Maybe
was it really heavy?
Relatively heavy. Yeah. I don't actually remember exactly how heavy it was.
I don't know why that feels really important to me. I'm just picturing, because I would have given up right away. Like, this thing weighs a ton. Forget, just leave it. But okay, you get this safe. You have your eye on it. You're like, we're taking this safe.
And that's what we did. And we went back to my house. But I'm not like a professional safe cracker or anything like that. So I told him, I'm like, look, we're going to have to wait until the sun comes up because I'm going to make a racket trying to open this. I'm going to cut it open with a die grinder and pry it or whatever it is I plan on doing. And so we're going to have to wait till the sun comes up. And he's like, well, I got to go home. I'm like, all right, well, why don't you come back and we'll open it up? He's like, no, just open it and tell me what's inside. And I was kind of like, okay, like I'll do that because you never know. I might find something really good that I don't want to talk about.
He was very trusting for a drug addict.
Too trusting, probably. Yeah. So basically I did. This is what I did. I waited for the sun to come up. I called him, texted him, told him that I was going to open it, and he just told me to go ahead. And so I basically spent a bunch of time cutting a corner of the door open. And then I remember throwing it on the ground a couple of times to try to loosen the door, and then I'd pry it a little bit because I really just wanted to get my hand inside. I didn't think I was going to be able to get the whole thing open. And eventually I pried open the door enough that I could reach inside. And I'd heard stuff rattling and stuff in there. It sounded like it was relatively full when things had been rattling around. And the first thing my hand made contact with was kind of like squishy, and it was soft, almost like it was a rag coated with like some thin plastic or something. And I pulled it out, and it took a moment to figure out what it was, but I realized it was a diaper. And it was a heavy diaper, so like maybe a soiled diaper. And so thinking that maybe someone had taken something like maybe fragile or breakable and just hid it inside the diaper, and that for some reason they were using the diaper as the protection, I opened it up to see, and no, there was nothing hidden inside. It was just like a soiled diaper. And I don't know, I never verified it, whether it was urine or anything like that. I don't know. But it was definitely a wet diaper. So I reached back into the safe, and I found another one and another one and another one. There was, I don't know, 3 or 4 of those heavy soiled diapers inside. I dug around a little bit more. There was a fresh pack of diapers, maybe 5 or 6 or something, kind of like in one package. And then there was some paperwork in there it was adoption paperwork for presumably whoever owned the safe. There was some photographs. There was a gun, a .22, and I think there was an ATM card in there. And then there was this memory card, like a memory stick that you would put into a camera. And so essentially there was nothing of particular value to me inside there. I wasn't planning on keeping a gun given my status as a felon. I know I was committing felonies anyhow, but gun just felt like an automatic 5 years. Don't ask me where the reason or rationale there is, because I was committing crimes that would get me 25. Whatever. I
see. Plus, you're probably thinking gun is just too easy to trace it. Like I could see why you'd be like, this is going to be more trouble than it's worth.
Maybe, or maybe it's just like if you get caught with a gun, you're just automatically like thought of as violent, where I don't know. I decided it wasn't of value to me. And strangely, the memory stick was the only thing that seemed even remotely valuable to me, because it was the same type that I was using in my camera at the time. So, yeah, I went and I remember I lit up a cigarette and I sat in front of my computer tower, and I put the memory card into the computer tower. This is dating it a little bit, right? Because we have a big computer tower.
Yeah.
All computers had them at the time, right? And I put it in there, and in kind of in thumbnail fashion, I remember like lots of little photos kind of streaming across a window on the screen. And my original impression of it was that I'd stumbled upon like somebody's kind of like homemade nudes, something like that. And so I clicked on one. I clicked on the first one, and I'm not going to describe, what I saw, but I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking at when I first looked at the first photograph. There was nudity, there were people, and I scrolled through 5 or 6 more photographs, and that's when I realized what I was looking at was a child and an adult man. And it was shocking. I knew stuff like this existed in the world, right? Like I know things like this happen. I just never imagined I'd be sitting at my desktop computer with it on my screen, and essentially knowing potentially who the person is, where it comes from, and who's doing it. So I knew something had to happen. I wasn't exactly sure what that something would be. But I knew I had to do something about it. And so I called the guy that, I'd stolen the safe with. I said, you need to come over. And he's like, what'd you find? I'm like, well, that's what we need to talk about. And so he came over, and I just did the same thing for him. I sat him down at the desk, and I put the memory card in, and he looked at it, and he kind of was confused at first as well. And then I scrolled a couple, and he's like, you got to get rid of this. I'm like, well, yeah. He's like, you need to like get rid of this now. I said, well, I'm going to turn them in. He's like, no, 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 no. I don't want anything to do with any of this. And I said, okay, I don't want anything to do with it either. Like, I didn't ask for this, but I'm going to have to figure out a way to turn him in. And he just kind of repeated over and over again, I want nothing to do with this. So I told him, I said, look, uh, I'll turn him in. And if it ever gets back to me, nobody will never know who you are. It's, people still don't know who he is, you know? And that's how that went.
Do you want to tell us?
No,
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
you know?
So at that moment, are you are already knowing it's going to be a risk because you're already thinking it could get back to me.
Well, of course it's a risk, yeah, because whatever I do, I'm gonna have to. I mean, I'm gonna do it in a way that I think will protect me, right? Um, but in the criminal world, like one thing you're not really imagining doing at any moment is taking something that you stole and figuring out a way to get it to the police, you know?
Right, right.
And so it felt inherently risky, um, you know. But I did it, you know. I remember I took like rubber gloves and I washed everything off, and you know, I put it in an envelope, and uh, I wrote like a note that said something like uh, from a fresh pack of paper. I like put a fresh pack of paper in the printer. I didn't want my fingerprints on it. It was like this whole thing, right? Like
Right.
absolutely everything to be untraceable to me. Um, and I wrote this note and printed it on that fresh paper. It said something like, "I stole this from such and such address, but I want nothing to do with it. Please remove this animal from the streets." And I wrote on the outside, "Please deliver to the police department," graphic photos, something like that, just to kind of stress what was going on. And I dropped it off in the mailbox.
Just did you address it to the police department or you just
Yeah, but I put
hope?
it in a mailbox where the mail person would come and get it. Like some,
Okay, got it. Got it. You know they don't have those anymore.
what do you
I mean,
mean?
you have to go to the post office to or put it on your outgoing mail. You're saying you just dropped it at a mailbox
I
on the
drop
street.
I drop mail off in mailboxes all the time.
They don't have any, but okay. I don't want to get in the weeds on
I
whether
just
there's
say
mailbox.
I dropped one off last week.
Interesting. Okay. So, so then what?
I
Did you
waited, you
wait?
know, I was like, I actually had, my mom was under the impression that I was buying, you know, like that all my money was coming from like buying storage units at auction. It was a good way of like, kind of like, why do you have all this crap everywhere? Because I was stealing so much. And so I called her and I told her, I'm like, hey, I bought this stuff, got this stuff at a garage sale. I came across this photograph inside. I turned it into the police, but, you know, keep an eye out for something in the newspaper. That's basically what I said to her. And then eventually, um, yeah, it showed up in a local newspaper, and all it really said was like anonymous tip leads to arrest.
Oh, so
And
they went and got him.
they went and got him. Yeah,
Okay.
they got him. Um, yeah, that's what they did.
And
It's
then the rest is history. You did a good deed. The guy got arrested. Enough said.
right, and so I just kept burglarizing or burgling. I mean, I know that if people listen to your podcast from across the pond, they're going to make fun of me if I say burglarize, but that's a thing we
Hmm.
sometimes say here in America. Uh, but yeah, I kept burgling, and eventually got arrested a couple of months later. I got arrested in April.
Oh, unrelated?
Yeah,
I don't
unrelated.
remember the story going down this way.
Yeah, it was unrelated. I'd sold. I was selling a lot of my. I was selling almost all of the stuff I stole on eBay, and I sold a radar detector that I'd stolen. I remember the night I had stolen it from a Viper in a wealthy neighborhood, and a Dodge Viper. I don't know if you remember those, but
I do.
so I'd stolen like a high-end radar detector, and apparently someone had registered it online. So when I sold it, it came up as stolen, and that's how the police found me.
Okay. I remember this differently that there was like a plea for they weren't going to be able to put this guy away
Oh,
unless you.
that happens later.
Okay. Okay.
That happens
Go
later.
on.
So the night I'm arrested, um, you know, the cops knew me, because I'd been on parole in the town, and when you're on parole, the cops just show up and they search your car and they pull you over, and if there's a burglary in the neighborhood, they just kind of come to your house and dig around to see if like you're the one. So I knew these folks, and eventually they just let me be because they realized like, okay, he had gotten his act together,
Mm-hmm.
while I was on parole, and there was no more incident with them. And then I got arrested, and the cops that arrested me that night were the very ones that I used to be relatively friendly with, in the sense that, they'd stop by and they'd do their thing, and that they were the ones who were like, hey, yeah, you're doing a good job, Matt, And so I remember I was having a conversation with one of them while I was kind of in the back of the cop car, and he said something along the line. I don't remember how it was phrased, but it was something along the lines of like, you were doing well, you were doing good, and now what? Like, this is it. Like, they knew my record, and I don't remember what he said, but he said something that just like so much shame came up, like so much. Yeah, like it's like the realization of what was happening, and some of it, of course, was just like, oh my gosh, am going to face life in prison, and some of it was like, no, he's right, And I did what most lawyers would tell you probably wasn't a good idea. I should have kept it up. My ace is a sleeve, like as an ace up my sleeve or something. But I said, well, at least I gave you Aitken, and that was the guy's name. I said that to the cop, and that kind of like piqued his interest a little bit. And so yeah, I guess they called their sergeant and a detective and all this other stuff. And so the detective that had been investigating me wanted to be the one to take me to jail that night. And so he and a sergeant drove me to the county jail that night and asked me if I would be willing to have an off-the-record conversation about the contents of the safe. And I have a feeling they were actually just trying to find out if I was actually the guy who done it, whether I was legitimately the one or whether I was just kind of making it up. And so they essentially asked me like, hey, how did it make its way to the police department? And I told them, and what was inside the safe, and I told them the same thing I told you. And they did. They kept it off the record. They never made that a part of public record, and they booked me into the county jail, and I was originally booked on 4 counts of possession of stolen property. And so I was facing 100 years to life.
Did they have the safe? Like, what did you do with the safe after
I
you'd
threw it
opened
in a
it?
ravine somewhere. I just threw it off a bridge into a ravine somewhere.
With the diapers and all the other stuff in it?
Yeah, I think I threw all that into a dumpster somewhere. But maybe what's not clear here is the reason they knew it was a safe, the reason they knew it was a burglary, is because, and this is kind of something I don't learn about until later, right? It's not anything I would have known at the time. That guy had been in that cottage while we were in the side yard stealing. And he'd gotten thirsty or something, and it was his parents' house in the main house. So he had left the cottage, walked across the driveway into the main house, and that's why he left that door open. He watched us steal the safe out the window. He watched us walk away with that safe. In a way, he watched his life walk away. And he called the cops and told them about the burglary. So he told them, I got burglarized and such, this is this. So imagine a day or two later, the same police department getting this note that says, I stole this from this address. And it's like the same address of the guy who just reported a burglary. So what's happening in the background, of course, while I'm out still stealing, is that police department has called him in to interview. They show him a blow up of his face from one of the photos on the memory card, and he apparently just melted and confessed right in front of them.
Wow.
So they knew about the safe, right? What they didn't know about was all those contents of the safe, right? They knew about the safe, they knew about the burglary, they knew about so much, the photos, right? But they didn't know about what it came along with. So they were curious about what else I may have found in there, right?
Right.
And then they booked me into the county jail, like I said, and I was facing 4 felonies, possession of stolen property, 4 counts of it, which would be 25 to life for each one. And I bailed out right away, right? Like it takes time for the fact that it's a strike prior case to show up in the computer. So I bailed out that morning. And when I came home, they'd they'd perform search. By the time I got home, they'd perform search warrants on my home, search warrants on my storage unit. There was like a couple of Excel spreadsheets, like stapled or taped or something like that, to my door that essentially said it was a list of everything they'd confiscated. And I knew I was toast. Like I just knew it. Like the sinking feeling, as you can imagine, it's like, yeah, sure, I'm out on bail and I have court in a couple of weeks. But this run is over, you know? And so I haven't done meth again since the night of that arrest. But I did drink and smoke a lot of pot for a couple of weeks as I decided what to do. You know, I was trying to decide whether I should run, you know? I mean, you know, as I imagined running, I imagined, you know, okay, I'll go to Mexico. I've got whatever, $10,000. Like, how long is that going to last? I imagined like the rest of my life. I'm 25 years old. I tried to imagine what it would mean to run the rest of my life. And it just sounded so fucking exhausting. It just sounded so just like an endless supply of what I was already doing, just hiding, living in fear. It just sounded so exhausting. And, but I was also scared to go to court. You know, I knew when I went to court that my criminal history will have caught up with me and that I would be going into jail. And I knew that it was going to be to face the rest of my life there. And so I remember the morning of April 22nd, 2005. I knew I was getting ready to go to court, and I got high one last time. I smoked pot, but it was enough to give me the courage to go to court. And I went to court without jewelry, without a belt, without a wallet, without keys to my house. I just went with cash because I knew that's all I was going to be able to bring in. And I remember standing in front of that judge in the courtroom, and the DA said, "Your Honor, Mr. Hahn's facing, at the moment, 100 years to life in prison, and it's an ongoing investigation, and we envision there being more charges. He should not be out on bail. He's a flight risk." And the judge ordered me remanded into custody. And they took me to the jury box. And the bailiff, or he's a sheriff, was kind of taking my property list. And he's kind of going through it. And he said, "All right, you know, khaki pants, collared shirt. Do you have a belt?" I'm like, "Nope." He's like, "Wallet?" "Nope." "You got any jewelry?" "Nope." "Keys?" "Nope." I'm like, "Do you have any money?" I'm like, "Yeah, I have $300 cash." And as far as I knew, that was the maximum amount of cash you could bring, like actually put on your books when you went to jail. And if I remember right, anything over that would have been something that you actually have to have turned into a check that family could pick up. And so I brought what I thought was the maximum allowable. And I think he knew that. And he kind of looked up at me and he's like, "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "Why did you come to court?" I said, "Because I don't have any fight in me. I don't have anything left, you know?" And in a way, like that is like that's the first stage of my surrender, you know? That's the last day I ever got high. I don't consider it my sobriety date. I wait for the next day, you know, my first wake up in jail on April 23rd. That's my sobriety date. But that was like my first surrender. And my recovery history, the years I would spend in prison, they're characterized by lots of different types of surrenders, but that was the first one.
So was anybody at that point telling you that, you know, the fact that you turned in the guy, Aitken, yeah. Aitken, that was going to help, that you might get less time?
No, nobody knew. I mean, there's like cops, of course, like that, you know, like probably were like gossiping about it, but that my lawyer didn't even know, right? It's not like anything that was on my mind at the time, you know?
Right.
That wouldn't come up till much later. That wouldn't come up till much later. And, you know, maybe a year, maybe 10.
Wow.
That wouldn't come up for some time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you go to jail, you have to be in jail while you're waiting for your trial.
Yeah. And, you know, it's around this time that, you know, I'm not getting high anymore. I was like really like kind of coming to grips with the fact, and I didn't talk about it much here, but I was married. I'd been married for a few years at that point, and she was leaving me. That close friend of mine was dead. I was facing the rest of my life in prison. It didn't feel like things could really get any worse than they were, right? And I had a lot of suicidal ideation. I comforted myself with the idea that, well, I won't actually have to serve a life sentence. Like this was kind of a habit of mine that I started to form during my time in the county jail. One that hasn't completely left me because it was so useful for so long, is to imagine dying as a way out of serving life in prison. But I was at such a dark, I was just at such a dark, painful place that I said, all right, well, maybe I should try 12 steps. Maybe I should try meditation and Buddhism. Like those were like the two things that like kind of came to mind for me. And the meditation and Buddhist thing, because I've been exposed to it a few years earlier when I was in college, and I remember filing it away in my head somewhere that said like, this is true. This would be a good way to work with suffering. I'm not suffering enough to do anything about it. So, but I'll hold that for later, right? Like there was that. And then of course there had been my exposure to 12 steps before, and like some of their predictions having come true. So there's some verified, like it's almost like the predictions that I'd heard in the rooms of 12 step about what happens when you leave and what happens when you relapse, and like the addiction doing push-ups. Like there seemed to be some verifiable truths to some of the stuff I'd heard. I'm like, all right, well, I'll try these two things. I'll pick up a spiritual path and I'll try these 12 steps because the worst thing that can happen is nothing. That was why I decided to try it out. And so I found a sponsor on the streets through the mail, and he started to visit me in the county jail. He started to, he took my collect phone calls. We did the steps through the mail. We did the steps through the glass in visiting. I did my 4th step and I did my 5th step behind the glass in a visiting room in the county jail with recorded phone calls where I couldn't actually read some of my 5th step because I was being charged and tried for the crimes that were written on the piece of paper. So I had to just hold them up to the glass in the visiting room so we could read them.
And for anybody that doesn't know or isn't familiar with 12 steps, 4th step is where you take an inventory of, it really is about all your resentments. You're taking stock of your part in a lot of your whole life. You go back to the beginning, you write everything down, all the resentments you have. And through that, then 5th step is you read it to your sponsor. Then your sponsor helps you see what your part is. It's a big process.
Yes.
That can set you free.
And in many ways it did, because, when I would lay there in my cell, I would often not be able to get to sleep at night because I would just stare at the ceiling and I would kind of like do a life review. We talk about, we've heard about near-death experiences, right? And how people's life flashes before their eyes. Well, facing life in prison was like a near-death experience, only it wasn't a flash. It was like this long, drawn out, just like wheels turning, recycling shame and remorse and shame, and just thinking about everything I'd done wrong and where I'd gone wrong and how did I get here again, and is this the end of the story? There's at some point my sponsor said to me, he's like, well, why don't you just write that shit down you keep thinking about? And so like that's what would happen. And like the dark red light of my cell at night, I would sit there and stew on stuff, and I just put it on a piece of paper, and it was a really messy 4th step, but whatever, and I did start to experience some freedom after having done that 5th step. But other things started to happen in my life too, like I mentioned, like that stuff wouldn't come up for 10 months, the stuff about the safe and everything. What ended up developing is that the prosecutor who was prosecuting Aitken for the molestation charges, she came to visit me with my lawyer in the county jail. And I had a conversation with my lawyer first, and he basically told me, like, look, she wants you to talk about the safe. She wants you to talk about what's inside, turning it in, all that other stuff. Don't talk about actually stealing it, though. Feel free to talk about possessing it, turning it in, contents of the safe, all that. Don't admit it to stealing it, because then there would be a record, like an audio recording of you admitting to theft. And like my whole defense, essentially in going to trial, was that I'm not stealing these things. I'm acquiring stolen property. So take me to trial, and you're not gonna be able to prove that I stole anything. And then I was like, really, it was kind of like a Hail Mary. What judge is really going to give me life in prison for just possession of stolen property? Like that was the Hail Mary, right?
Yeah,
Or,
that's
so
so smart.
yeah. So like, like the attitudes are starting to shift around the three strikes law. They haven't officially changed, but we were hoping that no one would actually want to give me 25 to life or more for possession of stolen property, right? And so his recommendation was like, don't actually talk about stealing it. And so I did this interview with her. And, she began by saying like, look, this isn't Law and Order. I'm not going to offer you a deal. There is no deal. You answer this question because you think it's right, but I can't offer you a deal. That's not the power I have. I will say this, that the reason we're interviewing you, the reason we're asking this of you, is that they have filed motions to have the photographic evidence thrown out in court. And that if they work, if the evidence can get thrown out in court, there's a possibility that he walks free. And I don't know if that motion would ever have worked. It was essentially hinging on the fact that the photographs had been acquired through the commission of a crime. And what the district attorney was essentially saying to me here is that if there's proof that the crime wasn't committed by law enforcement, then the evidence will be able to stand. And we need you to prove that the crime was not committed by law enforcement. We need the person to admit to having stolen it, is basically what she said. So she went through this whole thing. She asked me similar questions to the cops the night I was arrested. What was in the safe? What did you do with the safe? How did you send the photographs in? Probably ways of verifying on the record that I was in fact the person, because they know how they got in. They asked me what the different photographs on the memory card were, in addition to the ones that I saw. There were other photographs on there. What were those about? So they spent some time verifying the fact that I was the person, and essentially asked me, how'd you steal the safe? Did you steal the safe? And I hesitated, because it was another moment. Like it was like one of these. Didn't anticipate this being. I don't know if I've ever gotten this emotional around this part of the story before. It was an opportunity to do something right. And she pressed stop, she pressed pause on the recording and just kind of reiterated to me. She reiterated to me that kind of like the importance of what was going on. And then just pressed record again and asked it a different way. She said, from the moment the safe ever left, from the moment the safe was at Robbie Aitken's house, to the moment the photographs ended up in the Los Gatos Monte Sereno Police Department's hands, did anybody else ever possess them, or was it just you? And I said, it was just me. And are you willing to testify to this and everything else you've said today in court if we go to trial? And I said, yes. And she turned off the recording and she basically said, okay, we're probably going to trial, and I don't know what's going on with your case, but if you're convicted and when you're sentenced, I will be a witness on your behalf, because what you've done today is a good thing, but that's all I can offer you, And she went away. And I remember my lawyer said something to me that like always strikes me. He's like, that was gold. That's what he said to me. And I'm like, what do you mean?
Wait, your lawyer wasn't upset that you basically admitted to stealing it?
Nope. Because
wow.
What I realize, or the way I reason about it today, is that as my lawyer, he could not tell me to admitting to the crime. But as a human, he knew what I needed to do there, And so like I think like when he said that, there was some element of like what the advice he gave me and then what he hoped I would do, And so a number of months later, uh, as Aitken's case kind of continued to progress, um, someone from the local newspaper was showing up to the court hearings for him, and that district attorney, as far as I know, maybe they knew each other, her and the reporter, maybe they had some sort of conversation just about like kind of like the logistics of the case. Somehow I came up, and somehow the idea that I was facing more time in prison than that guy came up. And so he came and interviewed me while I was in the county jail, and he published it in the local newspaper, the story of the safe. And he certainly framed it a particular way. He titled the article "Risking a Life Sentence to Save a Child." So there was definitely a certain way of framing it that helped me out. But it ran front page Sunday back when things like that were important, and then it ran the following Sunday front page again. And eventually, I was offered a plea bargain. Eventually, the district attorney decided not to seek a life sentence with me and offered me a plea bargain. So that's what's happened.
What, and how much time was in the plea bargain?
14 years, 4 months.
Okay. Not a life sentence.
Not a life sentence.
Can I ask you this before I hear the rest? Like, did they share any information about like who the child was? Like, was that person in the child's life, or was it like a family? He was living, so that was his parents' house. Like, who is this child?
Well, yeah, he was living at his parents' house, but in the cottage out front, right? Because he was like 21 or 22 years old, and the child was his goddaughter.
Ugh.
Some family friend's daughter, and that he had occasionally been tasked with babysitting her and going on family vacations with the family and stuff like that. So that's the relationship. And I had thought like the child may have been 3 years old or something when I saw the photos, but it turns out she was 18 months old when it had happened.
Oh my God. Just a baby.
Just a baby. But she is, by the way, a healthy young woman today. Just throwing that out there. Because this is a long time ago now, but just want to mention that,
And did he do time?
Yeah, I think they went through a grand jury and there's like all these proceedings, and I think it was pretty traumatic for the little girl's family, her mother, parents, family, stuff like that. And they couldn't imagine really going through it again because that's what trial would be like. And so they, as far as I know, talked to the district attorney and said, look, we're okay if you give him a really long sentence, but just offer him a plea bargain. So what ended up happening is he got offered and accepted a 30-year plea bargain. So he got sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Is he still in there? No, of course not.
No, he came home, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. And so what is it, 2025? So I think he ended up serving about 17 years, something
I'm
like
sure
that.
he's totally fine now. I'm sure he's much better and has no. Yeah, I'm being sarcastic. Okay, so you have to go to jail for 14 years. How much time did you serve?
7.
You only served 7 years? That's pretty
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, there was a little bit of strategery in the way that I negotiated the plea bargain.
Okay, tell me.
Okay, well, they offered me, my first plea bargain was 11 years, 8 months. And that meant I was supposed to serve 80% of it. So that meant on paper, I was going to serve 9-ish years, right? And I wanted to go to fire camp one day. Do you know what fire camp is?
Yes.
Right, where people
in California.
It's where people in prison get to serve as firefighters, and they go and they fight wildfires and stuff like that. I wanted to go to fire camp one day, not because I wanted to be a firefighter, but because when you get there, if you're serving a 50% sentence, and this is what's important, you get time off your sentence. So if you're someone who goes to prison and your sentence, where your sentencing structure is you only have to serve half of your prison term, then I would get to serve 1/3 of my prison term. So I really wanted to go to fire camp and I wanted to get served at 50%. So as wild as this sounds, I got the district attorney to essentially agree that they wanted me, or my lawyer got the district attorney to agree that they just wanted me on paper to be doing 9 years. They didn't care how we structured it. So
Okay.
we restructured the plea bargain to be 14 years, 4 months, where I would waive all of my time served in jail, but serve it at 50%, which on paper would look like 9 years. But then when I got to fire camp, I went home 2 years early.
Oh, wow.
So a little bit of like kind of like it helps to know the system. It helps to um, kind of like know the ins and outs of sentencing structure and things like that. Uh, it's funny because I told so many guys when I was in prison, I'm like, hey, yeah, this is how they're like, how did you, with all of your burglary prior, how did you get this with 50%? You're supposed to be serving 80. And I told them, they're like, man, I should have done that, because they're sitting there in fire camp serving 80% and they realize that, oh, they probably could have done something similar. But yeah, so I got out 2 years earlier than they really wanted me to get out. But so I did 7 on the 14-4 and came home in February of 2012.
So when you went in, you were sober and you counted and you were intentionally sober. You were like, I'm going to change my life, even in the face of going back to prison, uh, your wife leaving you, or your marriage ending, all of these things. What inside of you made you decide, I don't care everything else that's going on and how bad it's going to be. Like, I want to be sober.
Well, some of it is circumstances, right? I know they say you can get lots of drugs in jail and in prison, which is true. And at the place I was in the county jail, there wasn't a ton at the time. There wasn't very much. Uh, and if I mean totally honest, there was a time about 6 months in uh, where someone offered me meth. And I got to my cell and I was talking with my cell and I'm like, you know what? Let's just pull an all-nighter. F it. Let's do it. And when I came out of my cell, and then they let me out of my cell, whatever, 4 hours later, and I went up to that guy, he'd already sold it. And so there was a point in my early recovery where I'm like, okay, like let's rock. But it didn't work out. But what started to change for me was it was around the time of doing that fourth and fifth step. At that point, I'd been kind of like practicing meditation for close to a year. So this is about a year into the county jail. And this is also when the media attention is starting to be spotlighted on my case. And I'm starting to feel like a sense of hope. And so there's like a little bit less pressure in terms of like kind of like the regret and shame I was feeling because I'd worked this fifth step. There's less pressure because I'm starting to meditate and get some sense of mental calm and maybe get a longer view of how my mind works, right? And then I have less pressure because it's been replaced with hope. Like, oh, maybe I'm not actually going to serve the rest of my life in prison. There are people on the streets who are like vouching for me. Glenn Beck, of all people, is vouching for me, thinking that I should not do life in prison.
Wow.
Like, there's during my first court case, I didn't really talk about this, but my first arrest, I'd burglarized a DEA agent. I'd stolen his guns, his money, his cash, his safe, right? And he went on Fox News and said that I should not be doing life in prison. Like
Wow.
that guy went to bat for me. Now, to a certain extent, it's because I'd gone and made amends to him when I came home as part of like the 12-step, albeit imperfect 12-step work I was doing at the time. And he mentioned that I'd come home and that I apologized to him and made amends for the crime. So maybe that's like some karmic repercussions down the line. But there were people fighting for me. There were folks from the neighborhoods that I'd been burglarizing who were like putting together petitions to try to get the courts to give me leniency. And so like all of that together was like, oh, there's reason to have hope. There's reason to have hope.
So you stayed sober through that first time that you felt really tempted and then did you work a program the whole time you were in prison?
Yeah. Yeah. So like what just ended up happening is like everything started to bear fruit. That's like the best way to put it. Like I was writing amends letters to folks and occasionally getting responses to them. As we know, you don't always get a response from an amends, particularly when you're writing from jail or prison. But I started to bear fruit. When I got to prison and Folsom State Prison, and I was sitting in Greystone Chapel for AA meetings, for NA meetings, I was sitting there with meditation groups, and I started to like just feel human again. I started to run into volunteers, people from the streets who were treating me like I was human, who weren't judging me for my past. Like all of this contributed to just kind of like my life started to feel worthwhile. Like my life started to feel meaningful. Like there was my first attorney who was a pretty good, I would say role model and friend of mine during my first court case, and then was my attorney during my second court case. He had come to visit me shortly after he had a heart attack. And he said to me something along the lines of like, I don't know why I'm here today because I probably should be dead, but maybe I'm here to save you from getting a life sentence. And he went on to give me this like very fatherly style advice. He said something along the lines of, he's like, look, Matt, I'm going to do everything I can to keep you from getting life in prison, but you're going to do a long time. Like you are going to be here for a long time, probably minimum a decade. And the choices you make now are going to determine what you're like when you come out. And he said this thing that I never forget. He said, this is your home now. Make of it what you will, but this is your home. And that was such important advice to me because he died a couple of days later of another heart attack. And then I got that other lawyer that ended up negotiating my plea bargain. But like just that idea that this is my home, like where I am at any given moment, whether it's prison or out here in the outside world, this is my home. And it's my responsibility to make this what it is. And so in the beginning for me, it was just like, I'm going to be a scholar. I'm going to read every book I've ever wanted to read. I'm going to learn to weld. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to finish college. So I just got like a lot of fire. You know, I just had this fire to do the things that like I'd really just never actually put my heart into, you know? And I got fire for meditating. I got fire for studying. I got fire for school. I got fire for AA. I got fire for recovery. I got fire for sponsoring people. My sponsor made me sponsor people. So I went and sponsored people in prison, you know? And that was a whole unique experience. Like sponsoring men in prison who are like in different cell blocks. And you just tell them, you got to carry your forced up around with you, bud, because if we happen to show up at yard at the same time, we're going to have to do a fifth step. So just start carrying it with you.
Right.
Wild stuff like that, you know? And so there comes a point in the path of recovery, path of practice, which is also how I kind of term my spiritual life. There comes a point where it bears enough fruit that there's faith. And I don't mean faith in a divine being. I don't mean faith in a creed or a doctrine. I mean faith in the sense of confidence, faith in the sense of trust, faith in this idea that I can make decisions that are right. And despite all like appearances of personal negative consequences, I can have faith that making the right choice will still end up better for me in the long run and better for everybody else. You know, now some of that's because of like turning myself into court that one day. And some of that's because I went ahead and did that thing for the district attorney. You know, like there were moments in my life where I, to a certain extent, like let go of the steering wheel, literally, of how the rest of my life would go and kind of said, all right, you people figure this out. But those gave me a certain degree of confidence to continue to do that on what felt like a much smaller scale later on. And so the path bore fruit, and there wasn't really any desire to do anything different. There was no desire to get loaded. I saw people get high. I had cellies that got high. I had cellies that shot up Benadryl and smoked pot and stayed up for nights on end, you know, doing meth. And it was just so honestly gross, right? Like it just felt gross, you know?
It doesn't feel like you'd want to be alert for more of prison. Feels like you'd want to go to bed early.
Well, that was always a joke we used to say to the guys doing meth. We're like, at least do heroin.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why would you want to do twice as much time? You get a 10-year sentence. You do meth, it's like a 20-year sentence.
Exactly.
I'm sober. I get to sleep away half my sentence. These heroin guys, my gosh, they're doing like 10% of their sentence, right? But these meth guys, they're doing all of it. They are doing lots of term.
Yeah.
Time. You know, it's a funny joke, but like the point I'm making is just like there came a point where nothing about getting loaded was even remotely appealing. It wasn't even remotely appealing. Eventually I'd make it to fire camp, and there's a lot of freedom out there. And, you know, like, because there's no fences or walls around the fire camp, you know, like there's a lot more drugs and alcohol available there. And even then, I'm like, nah, man, I'm good. Yeah, the weed smells nice, but no, it's just there's nothing really that appealing about it. I know like when we talk about the early 12 step program, you talk about like the difference between Dr. Bob and Bill W. and how um, supposedly Bill W. struggled with the urge to drink for all of his years of sobriety, whereas excuse me, Bill W. did not struggle with the urge to drink for the remain. Am I getting that twisted? Which
Well,
one?
didn't he also do some psychedelics in there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was a different thing. And that's what reminds me of like I was on the right track here. Is that Bill W. struggled with the urge to drink for the bulk of his sobriety, whereas as far as I know, Dr. Bob had the urge to drink kind of removed.
Hmm.
And and of course, these are the different experiences that people in recovery have. Some people kind of it's like I'm done, not even a chance. And some people are it's a constant battle. And that's of course I think why Bill W. did experiment with like an LSD therapy sometime in the 60s or something. Was it like in hopes that it might remove the craving.
I feel
Um,
like for me, uh, I'd struggled for so long with the moderating, and then that once I was like, "That's it, I'm done." I was really done. Not that I'm not, I'm still an addict. I still get like want to eat too much sugar and all the things. But once I was done drinking, I was just like, I can't do it anymore because if I do it again, it's just going to come back. Like once the craving went away, I always had the think through the drink mentality. What is this going to mean? If I drink this one time because I think I can handle it again, I know for a fact I will drink another time and then I'm just going to be right back there. But I mean, it took a long time of trying to stop and thinking about stopping and stopping for 6 weeks and then drinking again before I am done.
yeah, yeah, um, yeah. I definitely, at this point in my life, and I think basically for the latter, certainly the latter half, if not the latter three-quarters of my recovery, like I've felt done. I've felt done. Um, So I'm one of those people. I'm a believer in like the idea. I know this is controversial, but some people identify themselves as a recovering alcoholic or recovering addict. Like, and then some people might say something like, "I'm a recovered addict." Like, I don't identify as an addict anymore. I don't identify as an alcoholic. I will do it culturally if I go to a 12-step meeting because it's no need to. I don't need to rock the boat or anything like that.
Right.
But my identity does not no longer kind of like coagulates around the idea of alcoholic or addict. I don't think that is a justification for me to pick up. Um, but I don't revolve my identity. I don't kind of involve my identity with that anymore. And that's one of the beautiful things about like, the program of recovery I work today, which at the moment is Recovery Dharma. When we kind of introduce ourselves at meetings, we just introduce ourselves by our name. We don't say like, I'm Matt, I'm an alcoholic. It's just like, I'm Matt. It's what they call me. And it's an important, to me, it's an important shift. And there's a place, and I think there's a place for identification with alcoholism and addiction as well.
I
And
go
me,
back and forth on this because I I get the way you feel too. I do think it's important for people early in their recovery to acknowledge like this is a thing because I think your brain can really it for a lot of people the first time they really admit that it's an accepting of like, oh, I'm not a person who should drink. I have this thing. Do you know what I mean? Whatever we call it, I feel like it and this is going to sound controversial too. This is just my opinion. But when we lighten it all up and go, it's substance use disorder, and it's like, I feel like it's, oh, that's a thing that I could really get over very quickly. But I think if you acknowledge I'm not somebody who should drink, I have this thing, whatever that thing is, the ism, you know, when you say that out loud in front of a lot of people, or, however people want to do it, something changes. I think the load lightens when you just go, oh, and then later you can kind of go, yeah, that's a part of who I am. That's not who I am. I'm not Stephanie alcoholic, but I do have this thing and I do have to acknowledge, yeah, this is never going away. Like I'm never going to be somebody who can drink. I think for a lot of people that's really tough because you hold on to that idea that like, well, once I get over some of my emotional issues and once I deal with my past or once I maybe I'll be able to like drink socially. I know that I will never be able to do that.
Well, and I think if there are people, if people are inclined to think that if they no longer identify as an alcoholic, that means that they have now have the capacity to start drinking, then yeah, there's probably some danger. There's probably some danger in relinquishing that identification. And there's absolutely, without a doubt, um, identification as a process, not necessarily as like calling yourself a thing like an alcoholic, but the identification as the process by which recognizing that you and your life and your behavior and your history is, I won't say identical, but really not that dissimilar from all these other folks in the room. That's an important process, you know? Recognizing, seeing yourself and others is an important process because whether we're in recovery dharma or we're in 12 step, this idea that the selfing being at the center of all our afflictions is true in either case, no matter which way we're working our program. And by its very nature, selfishness is the mind's way of cutting itself off from the external world. It's the mind's way of setting a boundary between our experience and the rest of the world. And so if you are selfish, then the very thing that you need to cure that selfishness is to identify with and or connect with other people. That's why we sometimes hear that the opposite of addiction is connection, right? Because addiction and selfishness and self-centeredness is by its very kind of its very nature isolating, right?
Yeah.
So this idea of like I am me and you are you and you don't understand me. I mean, if anything, it reminds me of like a kid. You know, never understand me, mom. Like there's like a little bit of like, and we can kind of like we can enter the rooms of AA. We can enter the rooms of recovery dharma in this way, like, oh, y'all don't understand me. You don't know me, you know? And the human experience is there's a lot more commonality than I think we like to admit, you know? There's a lot
Yeah.
of commonality. And so recognizing that commonality and commonality in the way that we have suffered, which is what happens in the rooms of recovery, that's really important.
Yeah, I
Now,
definitely feel that some of the things about 12 step, but it's always, and I say this to everybody, take what you want, leave the rest that doesn't work for you. But I've never loved attaching a lot of rules to it, like the whole, we count days, but if somebody slips, then they have to come back, start over. And I think that prevents a lot of people from getting out of it just the love and connection, which is it can feel for some people like there's a judgmental quality to it. Like my time is better because I have more days. And I wish that that wasn't as much of a thing and it was just more community. And it just depends on the room you're in too, because a lot of places aren't like that. But you know what I'm saying without wanting to
I
say
do know
too
what you're
much.
saying. I do know what you're saying, and uh, it's never either. It's not an either or thing though, you know, because uh, well, it's true that simply having a sobriety count is not an automatic indicator of being a healthy, you know, healthy person, right? We've seen people who are kind of like grumpy jerks who have 20 something years of sobriety. That is
Yeah.
true. It is also true, you know, that there is likely greater potential for someone to have walked and developed in a particular spiritual path and made a certain degree of transformation with longer stretches of sobriety, right? So they've done something right, right? And
Yeah.
so I think we have to balance both of these things. We have to balance this notion of like time as an indicator of health with the idea that like, well, given a certain amount of time, there is a certain degree of healthiness that may have been cultivated over that stretch, you know?
Yes, but not everybody. So
Everybody.
there are plenty of people that haven't had a drink or drug in a lot of years, but they're assholes. We can agree on that.
We've met them.
Oh
I've met
yeah.
I
Oh
know them.
yeah. So just tell me about your life now. Obviously, it's pretty good. Married.
Married, not the same person, obviously. Wonderful.
No.
You've met her.
Yeah, I met her. Yeah.
Yes, you
So
have met her.
when did you meet her? How long after getting out?
Oh man. I met her like 60 something days or something. I
Wow.
actually, I actually, strangely, Our first date was on the anniversary of the day I turned myself in to court.
Wow.
So we met, and we decided in the beginning to use that as our anniversary because we didn't want my sobriety date and our kind of anniversary to be the same day. We didn't want them to share space. So
Uh-huh.
with our first date, even though we technically got together a day later. So we met 60 something days after I came home. Um, she's in recovery as well. Like a friend of mine was like kind of that I grew up with who now in recovery, she asked me if I wanted to meet this amazing person, and I heard her description. I was like, no, that sounds like relationship material because
Uh-huh.
I'm 60 days home from prison. Like I'm not really interested in a relationship at this point, right? And ironically, like, this friend of mine had asked her, hey, do you want to meet this guy? He just came home from prison. And she's like, no, I'm done dating parolees, right? Like that's basically what happened. And so this friend of mine actually just invited both of us to the same meeting on the same night without telling us that she was trying to hook us up. And
Uh-huh.
the rest is history. That was 13 years ago now. Um,
Wow.
we got married a couple of years later. Yeah, I came home from prison in 2012. Um, I finished the primary, like the transferable stuff with college while I was in prison, and I started applying to universities during my last year of prison. And so when I came home, I started getting into them. So I started at UC Berkeley. The summer after I came home from prison, I graduated from Berkeley in 2013. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and then despite my felony record, or I mean, with my felony record, and despite like graduating from Berkeley with a 4.0, I still couldn't find work because felons and scary, and so like I started to explore other options, and like I had some folks come in from a local trade union when I was in the county jail, and I'd always remembered something they said that was really important to me. They said, we don't care what your past is so long as it stays there. And like that just sounded so comforting because everything I was experiencing after coming home from prison was trying to find work and then having to justify myself, trying to find work and like, oh, you can really trust me, I swear. Like there was a little bit of tiresomeness with it. Some of it was deserved and some of it was like, come on, give me a shot. So I ended up joining a trade union. I got into an apprenticeship. I joined the IBW and I became an inside wireman an apprentice, and I did a trade apprenticeship for 5 years and
Wow.
a journeyman inside wireman. And so in a way, I was in school for like 8 or 9 years, something like that, straight after coming home. 8 years after coming home from prison. Became an inside wireman. I live in the Bay Area. My wife and I bought a house here in 2020. Yeah, like life is like really good. We've traveled a lot. I like, I mean, I haven't talked a whole lot about it, but I've really gone like really deeply into the Buddhist path. I've really gone really far. I don't, far is probably not the right characterization of it, but it's taken me far. It's like I've gone far and wide with it in the sense that I've traveled to India and Nepal in order to be closer to like some of like the pilgrimage sites related to Buddhism. I've gone to silent retreats in Myanmar where I sat for 20 something days in silence to practice meditation. And then I sit, silent retreats here regularly because meditation is such an important part of my practice. I even got ordained as a lay Buddhist minister a number of years ago. And I'm in trainings like constantly trying to like become a better person and figure out better ways of sharing it with others.
Wow. Well, you've shared your story with us, which I think is a beautiful thing. I think it's a gift. Um, they say it helps people to share your story and be honest. And I do think it helps a lot of people. I think it's going to give a lot of people hope. And um, I'm just so honored that you did this podcast with me, that I got to hear the story again. Because as I told you before I hit record, the first time I heard your story, I was on like a treadmill at the gym and I practically fell off when you got to the crux of the story. And I was just like, oh my God, this needs to be a movie. And I still believe it needs to be a movie. And I immediately told a friend of mine who listened to it. And then she was like, I agree. And then, so we know that your story's been optioned before. I hope it becomes a story, but you are working on a book.
Yeah.
So I hope that gets sold quickly. And I hope like somebody who's listening to this is the right person that can even help you.
Maybe
So
so.
thanks again for coming on. Where can we find you? I know you're active on Threads.
I'm active on Threads. It used to be other places, but we kind of moved operations over to Threads and Blue Sky, and Facebook at Hahn Scratch, Hahn Scratch. It's my last name plus Scratch.
Uh-huh.
Or just go to MatthewHahn.com.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Feeling like life is good, life is good.